Welcome everyone to GOA's Ask Me Anything live event. How do we make feedback impactful and sustainable? In today's live event, we'll hear from a panel of educators across GOA's network who will reflect on their experiences and also answer some of your questions about how to maximize the effectiveness of feedback in the classroom. Many of you who are here today know that last September, GOA announced its 5 educator competencies as a framework for professional learning. And these competencies really represent the essential skills that educators need to successfully support student learning outcomes. Last school year, we hosted a series of 5 events that started to explore what each of these 5 competencies can look like in practice. And today we're going to dive even deeper into the Assess for Learning competency by focusing on the practice of feedback. One of the key indicators for educators in demonstrating their ability to assess for learning is being able to create structures that provide students with timely and actionable feedback throughout learning processes. And our panelists are going to actually share what that actually can look like in practice. What does it actually mean to sort of create those structures that provide students with timely and actionable feedback? And they'll share those moves that make an impact. And so with that, I'll do some introductions. In our Zoom chat today, we have Becky Green from GOA. She'll be moderating the chat and collecting questions as they come in. And so you'll see her pop resources as well from time to time. And then our panelists today, we have 3 fantastic educators joining us today. The first is Alexis Wiggins, who is currently the curriculum coordinator at the John Cooper School in the Woodlands, Texas. She's previously worked as a high school English teacher, instructional coach, and consultant, and is the author of The Best Class You Never Taught: How Spiderweb Discussions Can Turn Students into Learning Leaders. We also have joining us Bowman Dickson. Bowman is a high school mathematics teacher at St. Albans School in Washington, D.C., and he co-authored a report called Feedback in Practice: Research for Teachers with Andy Huzio through the Tang Institute at Andover. And then finally, we have Katelyn Williams, who's joining us. Katelyn is a professional school counselor at Greensboro Day School in Greensboro, North Carolina. She's also on GOA's faculty teaching Intro to Psychology. Panelists, really the first question to kind of ask is, as one around setting the stage for this idea of feedback, and in particular, I'd love to hear from each of you, given that you are representing some different disciplines and domains. What is your sort of overall approach or mindset regarding feedback? What role do you see feedback playing in your respective disciplines, domains, et cetera? And so feel free, any of you, to sort of jump in and we'll kind of go from there.
I'm happy to start if you want.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bowman.
No, go for it, please.
Okay. I think it's really interesting to consider what we mean by feedback. And I think most times when we talk about feedback in an education setting, we're talking about feedback for students, right? Feedback for students to learn from. But I think that it's interesting to just kind of leave it open and just talk feedback generally, because sometimes we want feedback from students and sometimes we also want feedback on our own work. So I think generally it's good to remember that it's not just from teacher to student. But I think if we're talking about that kind of feedback to students, for learning, I'm sure it will come up today if it hasn't already in some of the pre-reading stuff, introductory stuff. But, Katelyn Williams, to paraphrase, says, feedback should be clear and specific, timely and actionable, also meaningful and things like that. And I think that in all disciplines, no matter what you teach, that is really important. And I think in some disciplines, it's easier than others. And I know in English, we've faced a challenge here at the John Cooper School of how to kind of truly use feedback to focus on learning, not just on grades. And that is something that we've been working on collectively as a department in the English department for the last 5 years. And I think we've cracked it. But I think it's also ultimately the eventual goal is also something Katelyn Williams talks about, which is it really has to be for learning as well. for ultimately transfer. If you're just improving a product, improving the grade, improving performance on a specific assessment, then maybe that feedback isn't fully realized or effective yet. That how the student takes that feedback and then uses it the next time is really what your ultimate feedback goal is.
Yeah, so to build off of that, Dylan Williams actually sort of came up a lot in the research that we did, that my colleague Andy and I did. And one of the other things he said is something that I keep coming back to again and again. What Andy and I did is we read a bunch of research about feedback and then compiled it into sort of a teacher-friendly resource, which I'll share in the chat in a bit. But I think the biggest takeaway that we had from our research was that I was always thinking of feedback as something that I did for students or I gave to students. But I've sort of like shifted to think more of feedback as something that causes students to do something or something that causes thinking in students, which sort of goes along with what Alexis was saying a little bit. And Dylan Williams had something, something about like learning is anything that causes thinking. I'm doing a terrible job at paraphrasing that, but I think the key is just thinking about what students are doing with the feedback you're giving them is way more important than the feedback you're giving them in and of itself. And it also helps sort of, transfer to things like peer and self feedback. So that's the one big thing that we got from our research.
I think those are some really good points. I think that, I teach psychology for GOA and I design curriculum for our middle school, but I'm a counselor first. And so when I think about feedback, I think about it as a really valuable social skill to help students learn how to engage, to figure out what to do with this feedback that I'm given. I tell my students all the time that feedback is just information. And I think that a lot of times, depending on how we grew up and the way that feedback was given to us, it can be triggering to hear the word feedback and think that it's going to be critical and think that it means something negative about me. And so just reminding students that it's just information, and what you do with that information is going to transform your learning experience. And so kind of helping them figure out, okay, once I have this feedback, what do I do with it? Well, if I don't understand it, I can ask clarifying questions, or it can lead me to dig deeper, or it can cause me to go in several different directions. And so just teaching them, okay, it is a neutral piece of information that you get to do something with. It's an opportunity for you to explore and dig deeper as a learner. Kind of transforms the way that we start from that sometimes intimidating word. But I love the chance that we have to help students figure out how to navigate that, because it transfers into all of their relationships with their peers, where maybe a peer is telling them something about themselves and they get intimidated by that. Okay, this is just feedback. This is information for me to choose how to use. And I love that you said it's something that we receive from students as well. So how do we teach them how to give us feedback that's helpful for us and respectful, but going to be useful as well? So I think it's a really interesting and fascinating tool that I love teaching students about as a counselor, because it applies to so many different things. And when they get a hold of that, they can go so far as learners.
All of that is so powerful. And I'm already feeling inspired by this conversation. There's a piece here that I want to sort of, I think, pull out a little bit before we get sort of deeper into sort of strategies. And Alexis, I think you brought it up, and Katelyn, it just came up a little bit in what you were talking about in terms of how sort of students look at feedback and the challenge that sometimes that exists from disaggregating grades and feedback. And that can really have sort of an impact, right? When you have a school culture that maybe historically has really put that emphasis on grades, what are some of the ways in which we can teach students to value feedback over grades, especially in these environments where maybe historically the emphasis has been more on the grades? Like what does it take to start shifting the value that we place on feedback? And I will freely invite any of you to sort of weigh in. But Katelyn and Alexis, maybe we can start with the two of you since you led us there first.
Jump in this time. I know that as a GOA faculty member, this is something we've really been navigating. And as we've shifted, from, kind of a regular grading system to more competency-based grading, to shift the conversation a little bit so that you're not just looking at the number, you're looking at the feedback, you're trying to figure out where am I on a scale of, developing to mastering to, really all these different things. How do we figure out to make that the focus? And I think that the conversation that I try to have with my students, and I think it's easier in some disciplines than others, right? Like in the disciplines that I'm in, there's not always a right or wrong answer. And so it gives kind of an opportunity for students to explore. And I let them know that in this process of having a discussion, I'm not looking for the right or wrong answer. There are some times that you do need to arrive at a certain answer. But the process of getting there, I'm appreciating the critical thinking. I'm appreciating the way that you're explaining it. I'm appreciating the dialogue, and that you can give feedback on those pieces of the conversation on the way to the answer that they're getting to. And so I think I tell students all the time, your answer may not look like someone else's answer. But if you're digging deeply and you're having conversations and you're always looking for more, a lot of times, if they're hearing my feedback, they're going to arrive at the right answer just by digging deeply enough and being willing to find it. And it takes some of the pressure off to hear me say, I'm not looking for a question and then the correct answer. I'm looking for your journey. I'm looking for your process. And however long it takes you to get there, as long as you're exploring, is going to be okay.
Yeah, thank you, Katelyn. And I think it's a great question. I think it's really about what you noted in some of the questions that came before about shifting a school culture, or shifting a culture. And I'm pretty radical. I'll be honest. I don't think you can do it in small ways. I think we've spent generations developing a system that is really outdated and puts a focus on grades, numbers, letters, and kids' futures are still dependent on that. And so you have some outliers. You have places like St. Anne's School in Brooklyn, New York, where they traditionally use narrative comments and no grades at all. That won't work here in Texas. We have an automatic admission system with our university system. And so we're not going to adopt things like that at an independent school or public school here in Texas. So I think culture really matters. And I think we need to be mindful of that what works in one school may not work in another school. And as Katelyn said, what works in one discipline may not work in another discipline. Having said that, I think it needs a radical shift. And I think that for us, I always say assessment is the tail that wags the education dog, because if you really want to change teaching and learning, change assessment and, change standardized assessments that most kids have to take, whether it's AP, IB, SAT, whatever, those are things that trickle down to other facets of teaching and learning. And so what started in our culture here in Texas at our independent school was an intense focus on grades was really driving us crazy. And we felt like we wanted to shift the focus to learning about 5 years ago. It was like every conversation we heard students having was about, am I 89.4 or 89.5? And if I can, it was just like, that's all they could focus on because they're high achieving kids and they have, clear goals. And so we said, all right, we're going to take the letters. We're going to take no numbers anymore, just letters. So instead of 89 and 88, it's just going to be a B+. And then it was like, well, what does the B+ go in as? Does it go in the system as an 89 or does it go in as an 87? So then we're like, okay, forget that. We're only going to give them rubrics with feedback now. We're going to have a second rubric that they get back with the number, the letter. We're just going to have them read the feedback so they pay attention to it first, and then they self-assess, and then we'll give them the number. But then they were still focused on numbers. So like every year we were sort of trying something new, and through trial and error, finally we're like, let's just do standards-based grading. Let's just look at standards-based grading rubrics. Okay, that wasn't enough. So then we nailed down this revision-based assessment thing. And I'll share an article I wrote about it in the same education magazine that Bowman also had his study published, his research published. But basically, we took all grades off everything. And students, instead of having a grade on any assignment, they get one of three words: publishable or professional if it's not a written assignment, revisable or redo. And publishable means you're ready for prime time. Great job. Revisable means you have something to fix before that's the case. Think of it like your D- to your B+. So it's a really big range. Redo means I can't assess this because you didn't do something you were supposed to, like I assigned a poem and you wrote a short story. So I can't assess this. You need to go back to the drawing board. It's not a quality assessment. It's like, I just can't assess it yet. And so by the end of the semester, if kids have 5 publishables, they have an A. If they have 4 publishables and 1 revisable, they have an A-, et cetera. So they are able to revise and redo and retake and represent until they're satisfied with their grade, or they get as high as they can. Sometimes there's not enough time to get 5 Ps, and that's okay too. So anyway, we've shifted the culture away from grades by getting rid of them on assessments and just putting feedback. And so now the conversation really is about learning, but that was a radical shift over time, and we had to do it through trial and error. So that was kind of a long explanation, but I'm for big change. I want to change the world. I want kids to take the focus in education off of numbers and letters because they're not helpful. We still need them, but I think we need to put the focus where it belongs, which is on feedback.
Bowman, I'm so curious to hear from you as well as a math teacher in particular, as someone who deals with numbers. Where do you stand with with thinking about feedback and grading?
The thing that pops in mind was that, like, okay, so it's funny that we often complain about students being obsessed with grades, and then teachers will grade every little thing that happens in their classroom. And so I think, like, I have 2 thoughts that come to mind about this, is that we just need to be putting less in our grade book. Fewer things need to go in our grade book. And second, both Katelyn and Alexis kind of mentioned this in their disciplines, like competency-based grading, and then is it revision-based grading? Is that what you call it? It's all seems like sort of all in the same vein of standards-based grading, and maybe like one step beyond. And that's really the biggest shift that I made in my math classroom, is to standards-based grading. I think if we want kids to worry less about grades, we have to have grades reflect our values. And if we value mistake making, and we always say that, and if we value students learning from mistakes, we have to let the grades reflect that. So I use a standards-based grading system where students can always update their competencies in various pieces. And sort of like what both Katelyn and Alexis mentioned is it's really shifted what I talk about with students. Is a student will say, like, instead of saying, like, I did really badly on this quiz, they'll say, like, I don't really understand how to solve a quadratic equation. And those are 2 really different conversations. The first one, I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, what do you want? I don't know how to help. Oh, what should we do differently? Like, it's really hard to have that conversation, but it's like, I didn't do well solving quadratic equations. I can help with that. And the student, I can give them resources to help with that. So I think shifting grading systems to shift the conversations is really what pops to mind for me for this one.
Thank you all so much. And again, really helpful to sort of start out at sort of that higher altitude and start to think about sort of systems and culture, and what are some of those pieces that we can start shifting to really support us in leveraging feedback. I want to shift gears a little bit and start to dive into sort of the particulars around feedback in the classroom. And in particular, thinking about, what are some of the feedback moves that have really made an impact in your various disciplines? And how do you know? How do you know that these feedback practices, whatever they might be that you've been employing, have had an impact? What makes them effective? And so I'll leave it open for whoever wants to dive in first, but starting to think a little bit about sort of strategies for the classroom. What moves are really mattering when it comes to feedback?
I'll jump in and I'll answer backwards. So how do we know that our strategies are working? In the spirit of feedback, we request feedback often. In the courses on the teams that I teach, we request anonymous feedback through just a Google form 4 times a year. And we always do it sort of kind of after, I would say, like at the end of a quarter. So students know that we're hearing what they say and we're taking it into account. And then we actually share the feedback publicly with them. So for example, a number of students might be feeling like we do, too many assessments early on, and, a larger group of students feels like it's fine, they like that, but there's a noisy sort of minority. And so sharing that feedback can actually be really helpful, because you can see actually there are a lot of students who responded very positively to that. So I'm a big proponent not only of giving feedback, but also receiving it and asking for it anonymously. I think is really important to get honest answers, and then sharing that. And so one of the ways I know that what works is through that feedback. So we've been surveying students, for example, over revision-based assessment every year, 4 times a year. And we have really compelling data that we can then share with students every year saying, you're going to try this now. And here is the data. It's 99.9% overwhelmingly positive from your peers in years past. And we can share it with parents to try to, shift the parent culture, because the parents often want the grades. And one of the things I'll say that has worked really well for us, and again, it might be more, better for some disciplines and not others, but I'm a big fan of portfolios. And I know they look differently in different disciplines, and some are digital and some are sort of showcase portfolios and some is everything. But to Bowman's point about having a conversation about what students know or what they don't, we keep everything in the portfolio, all the drafts. And so as students are revising, by the end of each semester, we have them do a detailed, like 40-minute portfolio review in which they go back and they read their first writing and they compare it to their most recent writing. And we ask them to specifically name some of the changes. And sometimes they'll laugh and say, Ms. Wiggins, I can't even read the first draft. It doesn't make any sense. I feel so sorry for you that you have to read this. And so I think that can also help be a way to sort of get feedback and also self-reflect and metacognitively have students understand that these processes are about learning. It may, maybe they got a grade or a P or an R or whatever, but they see the growth through the portfolio process. So I think that's one move that's been really important for our whole department to take on and really dive into with depth. And they get to keep them at the end of the year, except because college admissions now often require samples of graded work, we actually hold on to them for the juniors going into senior year, because we're getting more requests for those kinds of papers in the college process.
I think in my math classroom, I know when feedback is working, because with every single assessment I give, I will have a couple of new learning objectives and one old learning objective. And usually I make a bespoke quiz for every for different kids in the class with stuff that they need to work on. And just seeing them master things that they had not mastered before shows me what feedback is working. And I think the feedback that I never really thought of that I needed some sort of task for students to do once they got feedback from me on an old quiz. And so I think that's sort of the thing that I've focused on most lately in providing feedback on old quizzes so that I can sort of see their progress on new ones. So that can be anything from, sometimes I've just highlighted incorrect parts and then had them sort of fix it from there without really, because I think I used to just like write every single little thing down and basically solve it for them, to like going over, I used to go over quizzes in front of the class, but that really wasn't a task that they were doing. So I started to shift more towards something that I learned about from an educator named Michael Pershin, which are worked examples, where you like show a question done correctly and a question done incorrectly and have discussion questions for students to to talk about the incorrect solution as a way, as a task for them to do, as opposed to, forcing them to really engage with feedback about a quiz or assessment. So yeah, the two things I would say to that is that I've shifted to thinking of absorbing feedback as always needing a task from the student, and knowing that the feedback's working by always bringing back old standards to put on new assessments.
I think I really appreciate that. I do a couple of things. One is I try to do regular conversational check-ins with students just to ask them kind of what they need and if they feel like they're getting what they need. At the beginning, of course, when they're still learning you as a teacher, it's hard to say, no, I'm not getting what I need from you. And sometimes, again, as we're teaching students how to give us feedback, that looks like examples. So saying, are you getting what you need? These are some options of ways that I could give you feedback that maybe would work better for you. and they can speak up and say, what I'm getting from you is fine, or actually, I think I need a little bit more from you, or actually, maybe I don't need this much. I need a little less. And then what I love about GOA is we build in a midterm survey assessment for teachers from students that are anonymous, and then one at the end of the course. And those are super helpful for me. And I let the students know how helpful they are for me. And they usually hear from me after the survey, so they know that I looked at it. I didn't just wait until the end of the course to look at the midterm and the end of survey. If I'm hearing, the information that I'm getting from my teacher is really helpful, I appreciate that she is laying these different things out and then challenging me to do extra different things. Or I feel like I still have questions for my teacher after every piece of feedback. These are important for me. And so I circle back and say, so this is what I'm hearing from you. So I'm not pointing fingers at any direct person because I don't know who said it, but let me know what I can do to improve here in all these different places. And they seem to appreciate, number one, that someone's asking, and the opportunity to think about ways to improve the feedback that they've given. I think that a lot of times we ask students for feedback and we decide what to do with it, and we don't come back and circle around and say, okay, help me figure out what the solution to this issue is. And so I find that they really appreciate someone asking, okay, so this is, I'm learning that this is an issue for us as a class. How do we fix it? Knowing that we're all in this together and that you want to partner with them in their learning process really helps to build the relationship, and it helps them feel like they can trust you. And they start to bring different questions to you that maybe they wouldn't have asked before, because they know you're listening and they know that it matters to you to hear from them. So I think there are a lot of different ways that you can give feedback, but knowing that it's effective comes from conversational type check-ins. I find they really like that. Sometimes we do the surveys that are just like face value, digital things, but also just having a face-to-face with your teacher asking you, what do you need? Really builds the relationship, and they're willing to explain it to you, or maybe explain what other teachers have done that have been helpful for them, that I feel like they appreciate in different ways.
That, I mean, like that sense of like making that feedback visible, that, it's been received and also acted upon is so huge. I want to ask this question in part because I know that there are quite a few folks on this call who use this, but what about peer feedback? How do we make that a sort of relatively painless process, knowing that it is so important for our students to learn this skill? Do any of you sort of use peer feedback as part of your overall feedback strategy? And if so, what have you found to be particularly effective? How do we support students in kind of developing some of those feedback giving skills in addition to those receiving skills as well?
I'm happy to jump in. I may not be the best person to answer this because I feel like I haven't, early in my career, I did a lot more peer feedback and I didn't feel like it got the results that I was looking for. And so I pulled back on it as sort of my go-to or my first step. I've learned, at least in the settings that I've taught in, that kids are just too polite and they aren't willing to give helpful feedback, or they really don't know how to do that well. And it's a whole other skill set that I don't necessarily have time to train them in, in addition to all the other things we're doing. So I feel like I've actually stepped back from that process more in my teaching than maybe other people do. And so I might not be the best messenger, but I will say that in the current assessment structure we have, I think there's a really strong place for peer feedback because there aren't any grades. If like yesterday, my students had a big presentation and they were all nervous because they had to get up and do something individually. And so the class before, we allowed them to pair up and practice with each other and just get some helpful hints. And, the message is help your partner get a publishable, help them get a professional, as we call it, for a presentation. And so what do they need to hear from you to get that professional? Still, they're sometimes a little too polite. They just say, great job, it was really great, but that's not, actionable. So again, apologies, because maybe I'm not the best messenger for this one. I've moved a little bit more away from it or made it more of a formative exercise more than really kind of formalized it.
I think I think I feel similarly. It's really challenging to make sure that students are giving feedback that's valuable, because I think you're right. I think they're trying to be considerate of their peers' feelings. I think they're, and it can be challenging even as an adult to figure out how to word feedback to someone that maybe you disagreed with, or maybe you feel like that person totally missed the boat and you're like, I have no idea how to say this to someone that maybe I don't have a solid relationship with, or it's a challenge. And so I feel for them in that area. There are some places in our Intro to Psychology course where peer feedback is built in, and I think it is important. I think we kind of have to give them some guidelines and lay out what it would look like, maybe even some direct language. I find that it sometimes works better when we're having conversations to be able to do it in person. So maybe you can see that person's affect and tone versus just it looks kind of cold on a piece of paper writing, I completely disagree, this is not what we were looking for. But you can see someone say, so I get the idea that you were going for. I'm not sure if that was communicated in what you just wrote. Maybe some other ideas would be to do it this way. And then if you're in person with them, to be able to encourage them and give them some language, or ask them some clarifying questions if they've just given it's great, I think you did a good job and worked really hard. I think if you're in person with them as a teacher, you can kind of encourage them and give them some language. So what do you think is something that maybe they could have done better, or maybe what's something that you've struggled with that maybe you can help them with, and what you noticed in their work? I think just giving them a chance to give feedback without too much information or too many guidelines can be a lot to expect of them without some direct training and help. I think when it's done well, it's very, very valuable. I do find that when I do peer feedback, I let them do that, and then I have to come back around and do it again to kind of make sure that they're meeting the objectives of the assignment. But I think it's a real challenge.
Yeah, I would say something that pops to mind for me is that I feel like I'm a part-time math teacher, part-time math counselor in terms of like, or math therapist, because there's just a lot of math anxiety out there, and a lot of people who feel like they aren't mathematicians and can't be mathematicians. And I think in times of that really like comes to the forefront when peers are talking with each other about grades, about getting stuff right and getting stuff wrong. But I think like when students are working on math together, they are giving each other feedback all the time, just like constantly. They're helping each other. They're saying, you should do it like this instead of like this. And I think what I focus on is less in like formal settings, having, them give feedback to each other, like on, math work that they're submitting for reasons, but focusing on getting them to help each other in really productive ways while they're in the classroom with each other. And I think that really bleeds out to outside of the classroom, and those.
And I think for us, then sort of the big question too that comes up with just this practice of feedback is how do we actually make it sustainable? There are points, I think, throughout our school year where we find we're staring down a stack of assessments that sort of need to be attended to. What strategies have you found to be helpful in kind of keeping, while trying to understand and recognize that feedback has so much power to impact student learning? How do we juggle that? How do we balance that? And what are some moves that we can make to help us sort of balance and kind of conquer our feedback load? So any tips or suggestions for what that could look like?
So a few things popped to mind. So I don't think less is more necessarily with feedback, but I think sometimes more is less. Like I think if you give students too much, they can't even process it. So there's no point. And I kind of remind myself of that a lot when I'm, grading a quiz and I'm like tempted to just solve a problem for them. And I'm like, wait, no, let me stop. So I tend to try to call kids in, put like the idea of how to do something, and then like try to work with them one-on-one verbally, because that just takes way less time and effort on my end. And another thing that pops to mind is I've started to do, I think I mentioned this a little earlier, but started to do a bit more highlighting things that a lot of people are struggling with and doing tasks to remediate things that would be helpful for a lot of people, rather than trying to do it for every single kid on their individual quizzes or something like that. And I find that to be just much more sustainable. I still have to create a task and activity, but it can sort of attack a lot of misconceptions all at once.
I think the elephant in the room for all of us is always time. I'm looking at the chat and seeing we miss an opportunity if we don't really train kids to do good peer feedback. And I totally agree. That's why I said I wasn't maybe the best messenger, because I don't feel like I've been the best, participant in that process, and probably others have done it better than I can. But one of the reasons for that is time. And I remember when I, first had 2 children, within 2 years, and I couldn't handle the volume of take-home work anymore in this business. And I was struggling. And I remember my dad, who, worked in education for many years and was a great thinker and educator himself. I was a mentor to me. And I said, Dad, is it okay to use some class time to give some feedback? Because I just can't do this anymore all the time at home. And he's like, of course it's fine, but it was like I needed permission from my dad, but also just like an educator to be able to do that. And so that really shifted my practice. Having kids forced me to not take home so much work and try to repurpose that class time, kind of what my colleagues here are saying, and make it really useful, the way that, Katelyn was talking about relationships, and Bowman was talking about, less really is more. And so I was able to say, all right, I'm going to do I'm going to set kids up with this activity or reading or writing, and I'm going to go around to every single kid and check in and give a quick piece of feedback on a Post-it. Maybe it's a practice grade. Maybe it's just a little bit of feedback on something they brought in for the day. Or maybe it's just that one-on-one touch base. Like, how are you doing in this process? How can I support you? What Katelyn was saying. So I think for me, that reimagining my relationship with time in the classroom, and that was also a tool I had, and letting go of guilt, that I was using time, that was actually valuable time well spent, not like taking class time to do something I should have done outside of class. That was an important part of my process of making it manageable.
I completely agree. I think when I zoom back and look at our course, we sometimes have places where we build in bigger pieces of feedback for projects or things like that. Like, they're going to need a lot of feedback on this, or this is a step-by-step process, and I'm going to need touch points throughout this. But when possible, I love having, just those verbal conversations and then bullet points, so that we both remember what we talked about. And so it's documented there for both of us, but the conversation goes just more smoothly. And there's some students that just receive it better that way. You can say the exact same thing written down, but when you just talk with them, sometimes they receive it better and they hear it better, and they know exactly what you mean because you look them in the eyes when you say it. And so kind of knowing who some of those students are and making sure you give that feedback in a way that's meaningful for them, I think is important. And it took me some time too. I remember at the beginning of teaching the Intro to Psychology course, I told my coach how long it was taking me to do some of my grading, and he was like, how long can you do that for? And I was like, not much longer. That's why I'm talking to you. And so we worked out some different things, which were really helpful. Like for the Intro to Psychology course, one of the projects that we do, I'm just able to do some video recordings where I'm like screen sharing their PowerPoint and going through and saying, this looks really great. This looks really great. Here's something that I would change here. Took a minute for every student, and it was so much faster than everything else. And they love that type of feedback because they see my face, they hear my voice, and they have a chance to reference it back when they're working through things. So just looking at feedback in different types of ways that maybe we haven't tried before. Even though I think you're right, Alexis, sometimes it feels like cheating, but it's really not.
I used to share an office with a guy who would give verbal feedback on all student papers, which sort of sounds like that, which the kids love too. I did not love it as the person sharing his office with him, but it was very effective for the students. So.
All of that, right? Like thinking about like, how are we, again, we know we work in these structures and systems, right? Like, what are ways that we can start bending or even pushing against them a little bit? That's definitely been sort of a theme that's come up. Sort of the last kind of submitted question I want to get at, I think we will get at a couple of questions that popped up into the chat. And so this is my plug again, if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to start popping them into the chat. The big question, and I used to face this as an English teacher, was I would spend this time giving feedback to my students, however many hours it would take outside of my workday to do this, and then just seeing a student sort of toss the feedback into the trash can on the way out, or just flip to the grade and kind of sort of move on. And so the big question around feedback, right? We know it's impactful. We know that there's strategies to make it effective. But part of that equation is also having students be able to receive, process, interpret, and then apply that feedback. What are some strategies that you've seen that have been helpful in supporting students in really processing and applying the feedback that they're receiving?
A friend of mine, Caroline, who I think might be in the audience today, she said this was a cool idea from her. She just has her students write back to her what they heard in the feedback, which does a couple of things. First, they need to, or it's summarize what they need to do next. It helps her see, even because sometimes they don't get the right thing from our feedback, which is a huge issue. So it helps them think about the feedback, rehash it in their own words, and then also you get to hear what they heard, so you know that they're on the right track. And I try to think about what I can do with that as a math teacher. I a couple times have had them try to guess first of all, I think routines are really helpful for a lot of things, but sometimes it's also helpful just to do something sort of out of routine, just to get them thinking about something. So a couple times a year, I'll have them, take a quiz and guess their standard grades on it. And that, that it's a little bit grade focused, but it gets them to look at their feedback and think, okay, did I actually master this thing? Did I actually master this thing? Did I actually master this thing? And then the other thing I have done a lot is just every now and then just having them resolve new quizzes with slightly different questions, or do test corrections with verbal responses too, where they sort of explain anything to sort of show me that they've really processed what's going on. But I guess the caveat with all of this is that it does just take time. It's more student time than anything else. But I think we just need to build in more of that reflective time into our instructional plan.
Until recently, I didn't have a good answer for this. I'm a career English teacher, and it was very frustrating to me. And I read all the books, and Katelyn Williams would say, put 3 pieces of feedback only anymore, and your brain can't process it. So it's I'm going to focus on the 3. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. I was always searching for a good peer review, this, that, everything. Again, not to beat a dead horse, but we figured out how to shift the focus entirely away from grades to learning and feedback through this process of revision-based assessment. And I'm going to share a link now to the resource doc when I present on this for schools. I give just a Google Doc of all my resources. On that is all the rubrics we use. And the rubrics for us were key. We took 2 years to design backwards from criteria that we wanted to put on every rubric. So we have a menu of criteria that we choose from to build each rubric. So criterion A is knowledge and understanding. Criterion B is presentation and organization. So we pick and choose what we're going to put on each rubric. And then we change the descriptor very specifically for each assessment. And then there's a long kind of feedback box after each one. Shifting it to a standards-based rubric like that, without numbers, without values, and allowing students to revise everything they do just shifted everything for us. So we write quick, the rubric is so detailed and specific that we write quick feedback. The actionable part is in order to get publishable, you got to do this. Your works cited page is formatted wrong. Fix it according to our, works cited guide. And then it initiates a conversation. So either the student understands the feedback and changes it and tries again, or they come see you, and it might be a 30-second conversation. It might be a 30-minute office hours, but we're going to get to kind of connect with the student and say, oh, no, you didn't understand that feedback, or yep, that's exactly what you need to do. Go ahead and revise and turn it in. So this is our 4th year now doing this. And every year it started with me, it spread to a couple colleagues, then it spread to a whole team. And now our entire department is using it, and nobody wants to go get back because kids are not talking about grades. They're talking about learning, and they're coming to us with questions about feedback. But this is the only thing I've figured out for English. Physics teachers, you got to figure it out for yourselves. I don't have a model. So I'm going to share the rubrics I have for English grade 10 and grade 12 this year, if it helps anybody.
That's really cool. I like that idea. I think the way that I see feedback as like a culture that we generally think about is, it's kind of a broken conversation where it's like an assignment is done, a teacher grades it, that's the end of that conversation. You start a new one with each assignment instead of it being a continuous thing, a continuous conversation of an assignment and the feedback, and I reflect, and that's how it changes. And so thinking of it as more of a continuous conversation kind of helps our students to see that they still have a role in what happens with that feedback, and that it impacts their future learning. And so I think just teaching them that their responsibility doesn't end once they've gotten a grade on something, and that it really does connect to their future learning, even if the topic has changed or the unit has changed. What you've learned in that time impacts everything else. And again, that's a complete mindset shift. And so maybe giving them a specific role to do after that feedback, like Bowman said, of, okay, this is what you do after you've gotten this feedback, whether it's just a self-reflection, or maybe it's a set of 3 questions that you're supposed to ask yourself and get back to me after every assignment. Like, do I understand my feedback? If not, what are my clarifying questions? Did I learn something from my feedback? Small things, but something to show them that their responsibility is not finished once the assignment is turned in. Once they have the feedback, they're still responsible for another piece.
Yeah, and I'm picking on this thread that I think all 3 of you sort of touched on, is that we have to build some of this into our existing schedules, and sort of thinking about, what we classify as instructional time, right? Like, how do we make some of those shifts to allow some of these processes to live out? Because it seems like this is where that deeper learning is really taking place, right? Investing in, as opposed to sort of disseminating content or spending time on activities, right? Like, really thinking about, like, are there feedback blocks available within our schedule, or even if it's 5 to 10 minutes each week, how can we build in that time for our students to really engage with feedback that they've gotten? Thank you all so much. I'm looking at the time and I'm trying to make a decision of whether we have time for questions from the live audience or whether I need to wrap it up. And I'm going to risk it. I will ask Becky. Becky, is there a particular short question that might be worth answering, or should I wrap this up?
I'd love the question that helps us walk away with just a fast practicality. And so I would just invite like a quick whip share from the 3 of you. If everyone in this audience were to walk away today and try out one thing in their practice, what would your recommendation be to them? What's a small shift we can all think about as we leave this conversation?
On your next assignment, give them back the assignment without the grade and let them engage with the feedback, and then keep the grade somewhere else. Just experiment with that once if you've never done it.
I would say find a way to practice feedback in your classroom in a really low stakes way that has nothing to do with grades. It might not even have anything to do with your content area, but something that's going on in the world or going on in life that they can give you feedback, their honest opinion on, and know that you're listening, and something that you can implement in your classroom as a result, so that it becomes a comfortable thing to do feedback with you as a person, as a teacher who's listening to them.
I don't know that I have a quick fix or a quick takeaway, but building off of what Bowman and Katelyn so wisely expressed today, I would say develop and deepen relationships with your students, because I think they're going to be much more receptive to your feedback if you take 30 seconds or 5 minutes to talk about their dog that they love, or their cheerleading competition that they were in, or the math competition that they just participated in, and you know, let them know they feel, as the mom of a 9th grader this year, they are so much littler than we think at every age, and they really do want your approval. And I think they're going to be much more open to your feedback when you develop those relationships and they know you care. So
this has been such a fantastic conversation, and I wish I could chat with you, all three of you, all day. And I'm also starting to mentally think about some of the feedback mistakes and mishaps I've probably had in the past, and what I would do differently. But thank you all so much for just the actionable advice that you provided, just the information on strategies, and then also your higher level thinking around it. It's just a really helpful framing, especially as we're really starting a new school year. There's ample time for us to start implementing some of these approaches.